Welcome to NIST Think Out podcast series, episode 5, brought to you by NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity. My name is Sulfikar Amir. I'm the host of this podcast episode. At the NTU Institute of Science and Technology for Humanity, we aim to contribute to the production of new knowledge and innovation with stronger ethical, social, economic, and cultural considerations. We are a research excellence institute that addresses societal challenges through transdisciplinary team research, where we seek to bring the interdisciplinary field of science, technology, and society, or STS, to engage with various issues in our society, both at the local and the global levels. Now, in this episode, I'm extremely pleased to be joined by Professor Dominic Wilkinson, who is a bioethicist of international renown. He is currently a professor of medical ethics at the University of Oxford, where he is also the director of medical ethics and deputy director of the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics. In addition, he's also a senior research fellow at the Jesus College, Oxford, the visiting Tochinche Professor in Molecular Biology and Medicine with the Center for Biomedical Ethics in NUS. And of course, he's also a consultant in newborn intensive care at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. Thank you so much, Dominic, for coming to our podcast series. I'm going to ask you a few questions regarding what you've been working on in the field of bioethics, but I'm interested in knowing about your backgrounds. How do you end up in a field that is not really popular to many people, which is ethics? So what drove you to studying this field, and why did you find this field to be fascinating?
Well, I guess I started out training in medicine. I'm a medical doctor specializing in the care of very sick newborn babies. But along the way, it became clear that there were really very difficult questions that we had to grapple with that go beyond the science and the technology, that relate to the science and technology.
Sure.
There's lots that we could, in theory, do, but we have these recurring questions. Should we do? And to answer those, we need good science, but we also need ways of thinking clearly about those problems. And I thought that was very interesting and challenging, so I did some further study. I did a master's at Monash University in Melbourne, and then later a PhD in Oxford. And the idea was partly selfish, to help me to work out what the right thing to do was, but also it seemed to me over time that I could help others to try and think clearly. Sometimes, whether it's in medicine or in science or in society, we find ourselves kind of lost. We're in this really confusing space. There are roads in different directions and we've got lots of noise around us. And sometimes what we need is somebody to provide us with a map that says, okay, well, you could go in this direction or this direction. These are the reasons. These are the arguments that might help you to decide which way you go.
Does medical education provide that map, or do you have to find it somewhere else?
Well, I think medical education is very good in lots of countries at giving people specific scientific knowledge to be able to practice medicine. I think increasingly medical schools work very hard at giving students the skills at assessing and generating knowledge, because the medical knowledge that is up to date and accurate at the end when you finish your medical degree is going to be out of date in 5 or 10 years. There are hundreds of drugs that have come out since I graduated, probably more than that. Many conditions that didn't exist, technologies that didn't exist. So they need to have ways of being able to evaluate that. That's the sort of skills of scientific appraisal. But what medical schools often don't have time to do is to give students the skills at thinking critically about the ethical reasons that apply. So that's what almost all medical students have some ethics education. It's difficult to fit in when there's so much for them to learn.
Of course.
But certainly what we would hope to teach our medical students in Oxford, and I'm sure the Centre for Biomedical Ethics here in Singapore focuses very much on giving students the ability, the skills to think critically about reasons and arguments. That is the parallel to the sort of critical scientific analysis skills.
When was the moment when you think that you want to bridge or to cross the bridge between medicine and ethics? And how did you manage to capture a new field of knowledge that probably it's not really covered in your previous education or training?
Well, I think most people's careers evolve organically.
Of course.
They start out on one path, and then as they're going along, there's this really interesting thing off to the side, and so they kind of go off the main road, and they go off, and sometimes they go back to the main road, but sometimes you find you're just in a new and interesting space, and you think, oh, well, I'll keep going. So for me, it was that sort of journey. It's very difficult for me to remember a particular moment when it became clear to me that my career was going to be in this relatively unusual mix of medicine and philosophy and ethics. Sometimes when you follow the road in front of you, you find yourself looking back and think, how did I get here? But that occurs to all of us.
Okay. Well, I understand that your expertise now is pediatric ethics, which is basically a branch of bioethics that analyzes moral aspect of decision made relating to the healthcare of children. Now, tell us, what pediatrics ethics is and how is it relevant to these days, to the context of today's time.
Well, pediatric ethics generally it most often relates to the medical decisions that we make for children. So it's the sort of sub-field within ethics about medical care of children. But we might think of it more generally as ethics specifically relating to children, because lots of the decisions that we make affect children. What's obviously different about children is that depending on their age, they may or may not be able to communicate their wishes or to make decisions. So one of the key principles, ethical principles that's important to weigh up for adults is their freedom to make choices, good or bad, for themselves. We think usually that adults should be free to make mistakes.
Of course, yes.
And it's important too for children to make mistakes. But if they're serious mistakes, we as parents might try very hard to prevent them from doing that. So we make our children brush their teeth when they don't want to. We make them do their homework and go to bed at a decent time. We make them have medical treatment, perhaps, that they don't want to. So, of course, we wouldn't do that for an adult. We wouldn't force them to brush their teeth. We can't force them to do their homework. You can only encourage them. So that leads us to a different space where we're making decisions for another person. Of course, the other element to that is that children are developing. So this is not the answer when we're thinking about medical questions for children or other questions like how do we think about their education? How do we think about their participation in wider society? There's not one answer because children vary. They vary from the newborn, who's very immature, very dependent, to the young person who's almost an adult, and everything in between. And of course, we include within pediatric ethics individuals whose capacities, whose abilities, because of underlying disability, may mean that they're stuck somewhere along that or slower along that path. So we also need to have the flexibility to think about having multiple answers or answers that can change. Again, adults differ in their capacities, but we tend to think, well, we need to have answers generally for adults. Maybe we have special answers for adults who can't make decisions for themselves.
I see. So we know that pediatric ethics is sort of very specific on the children, while the field of bioethics has a wider scope. So what are the key principles in pediatric ethics that distinguish it from bioethics in general, or maybe medical ethics in general?
So I think I've mentioned a couple of the things that are different. One is that children, depending on their age, may not be able to make decisions for themselves. The other is that they're like a moving target. They're changing in their capacities. And of course, we need to have more than one answer depending on the age of the child. But I think there are some other considerations. One is that, of course, care of children is incredibly important because they are the future of our society. So we have very strong ethical obligations to take care for them, to take care of them. There's another interesting consideration, which is that, like another group, our obligations towards them are asymmetric in a sense. So when we make decisions in relation to other adults that we have ethical obligations that go in both directions. I have obligations towards you, you have obligations towards me. And that, of course, partly generates the way that we treat each other. I treat you in a way that I would like you to treat me, for example.
That's right.
When we make decisions for children, we have ethical obligations towards them. They have some obligations, but again, depending on their age, those might be quite limited towards us. Though I guess we hope that in the future, if they come to adulthood and are able to, that they will take care of us. So we have reasons, sometimes selfish reasons, to want to make sure that we look after those children so that we ourselves in our older age will be looked after. But there's another version of this when we think about future children or future generations where that doesn't apply. We can make decisions that will affect the future generation, and of course they can't make any decisions that will affect us. So we have to look forward. We're looking to the future and thinking about not only how do we want our society to look in the future, but the ethical obligations can't go in the other direction. So it generates a different sort of ethical reason, not necessarily less important. It might be even more important.
Of course.
Because actually the significance of that future for humanity. But it means that we have to think about some of those questions in a different way.
So currently you're holding a leadership position at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics in Oxford. Can you tell us about this research center and what does it do and what is the main objective of the activities? So
the Uehiro Centre in Practical Ethics was founded by a very generous donation by a Japanese philanthropic foundation.
Oh, really? Okay.
That was established by a Japanese businessman, Mr. Uehiro, who was a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing.
Oh.
And he had been, as you might imagine, enormously influenced by that tragedy.
Of course.
To think, as indeed many people do, about how could that be prevented in the future. And one of the things that he felt was very important was education. That's obviously relevant to children.
Sure.
And ethics. How can we think better about the problems that we face so that we don't make the mistakes of the past? So the Foundation for Ethics and Education, the Uehiro Foundation, established a chair, a professor position that was held for a long time, continues to be held by my colleague here in Singapore, Professor Julian Savulescu, and a chair in what at the time was a very new subfield of ethics, practical ethics. So we've talked about a subfield of ethics, pediatric ethics, but practical ethics in a sense is that wider area of ethics, thinking about how can we make a difference.
I see.
What questions matter to the world, and how can we improve the way that the world thinks about these. Again, very specifically thinking about how can we avoid making the mistakes of the past as we move into a world in which we have other technological choices, AI,
of course,
genetics, healthcare related choices. We hopefully won't make mistakes in relation to nuclear weapons, but there might be even more dangerous choices.
Definitely, yeah.
So the idea of practical ethics, the idea that underpins the centre in Oxford is to help our societies to think more clearly, more rationally, and hopefully to make better decisions.
Can you elaborate, the term practical in practical ethics? What does it mean?
Well, ethics, the study of how we ought to behave, can be at different levels. Sometimes it's at a very theoretical level. It's like theoretical physics.
Oh, of course, yeah.
So it's studying things that seem very abstract. It's like those mathematical formulas or those theories of multiple dimensions. From the outside, you think, how does that help us? Of course, some of that theoretical physics, just like some of the theoretical ethics work, underpins much more applied things. Like, for example, the technology that we're using in recording this podcast depends on quantum physics.
Exactly.
We don't think about it.
No, of course.
But somewhere underneath that, the insights of physics, of theoretical physics, then have impacts on very applied physics. So practical ethics is applied ethics, and it's applied ethics in two ways. One is it's looking at how ethics is applied, but it's also looking at how we can use ethics to make a difference, to impact policy. So for example, during the pandemic, we were involved in trying to provide input, sometimes more successfully than others, into the decisions that our governments were making in relation, for example, to vaccines, isolation, quarantine, allocation of resources. These were really important ethical questions, and we thought it was important to try and help both the public understand these debates and, in theory, not sure they always listen to us, the politicians when they were thinking about these difficult decisions.
You just mentioned about some of the emerging technologies. So how do you think the advancements of technologies such as AI, biogenetics, nuclear energy, and etc., figure into the issues of pediatric ethics? I mean, how is it relevant to the explosion of a lot of new things, and especially technological innovations that shape, children's behaviors these days?
Yeah. So I think partly this is very difficult to answer because it's hard to know what the world in which today's children will live in. It's hard to know exactly what practical questions they will face. So, however, I think there look to be some very pressing questions in relation to these technologies and how they might have very harmful effects on children. So particularly when we're thinking about AI, we have made mistakes over recent years in some of our decisions in relation to other advances in information technology and social media. And those mistakes, the ways in which we've embraced that technology, have had very significant and continue to have very significant effects on children. Children developing and growing, for example, exposed to very harmful images, exposed to very harmful influences, and with potentially with effects on their ability to, for example, concentrate or attend to and learn. Of course, lots of these challenges we only learn as we go along, and sometimes it's easy to look back and say, well, we might have made different decisions then. We have to make decisions in the face of uncertainty without knowing exactly how these technologies will affect young people, but and we shouldn't be paralyzed by that into saying, well, look, we can't make any advances. We shouldn't do anything, for example, in the AI space, just in case it would harm our children, because these technologies also have the potential to benefit.
Yeah.
But we do need to pay very careful attention to the possibility that these types of technologies will harm, for example, our children's education, their learning,
of course,
or their decision making. I think one of the real worries is that that these types of language models might become very good at persuading us of things that we otherwise wouldn't have chosen. And of course, children are very vulnerable. Young people are very vulnerable to exactly that, to persuasion, to making decisions. So will people use these technologies to radicalize our children, or to convince them to do things that, to buy things, to pursue courses of action that actually would be unwise? When adults, we talked already, make decisions, they're free to make mistakes. We will have to grapple as a society with how to deal with people's freedom to be persuaded by technology, by AI, persuaded to vote, for example, in a particular direction. So there's some really fundamental challenges for our future democracy. But those challenges are multiplied when we're thinking about young people who are very sensitive to influences, to persuasion, and of course, who may be led to make harmful choices for themselves.
In my understanding, ethics is about the relationship between individuals and between groups, right? Which is based on consensus. If you don't want to harm people, then you don't want to be harmed as well, right? Now, looking at what you just explained, pediatric ethics, I think, is more about protecting the children. But to what extent that it can also have some impact on shaping their behavior in terms of looking at the future and having a sense of responsibility to the environment, to society, and etc.
I think we need to temper our desire to protect children with a desire to empower them. Sometimes I think we're inclined to want to make all the decisions for children, and then, well, of course, once they get to 18 or the age of majority, then they'll make decisions for themselves. Yeah. But we need to be able to allow them to develop the capacity to make decisions. And of course, if we make all the decisions for them and then suddenly they get to 18 and then now they can drink and drive and do all sorts of things simultaneously, they might make foolish choices. We want them to get to the point when they reach that age of being able to make good choices for themselves. So part of what we have to do as parents and as educators and as societies is to give children the skills to learn to be able to make good choices.
Yeah.
And we can only make good choices. We can only learn to make good choices by having opportunities to choose, and sometimes to make less good choices. So that when we're parents, we, for our very young children, make all the decisions for them. We don't allow them to for example, not brush their teeth or go to bed very late. But as they get older, our ability to control all of their decisions diminishes, but also we think it's important for them to start to make decisions. So we need to support them in that process. So that's one of the challenges in education and in healthcare, about enabling them as they come into adulthood to be able to be fully autonomous adults, make choices that are right for themselves, and hopefully are good choices for themselves when they come to be adults.
Now we've come to the last question. In your opinion, what will be the most challenging issues to be faced in the pediatric ethics, in the near future?
Well, I think we've mentioned some of them already. I think AI is potentially going to radically change the ways in which we interact and communicate. It's going to change some very fundamental questions about how we access knowledge and what we understand to be true and false. It already is. There are lots of other advances in medical technology that are going to be very important in pediatric healthcare. We've been talking for a long time about a move towards personalized medical care that is right for each individual rather than being right for populations, that reflects an individual's unique genetics. So, for example, the specific modifying the medicines that might help somebody who's got a headache in the light of their genetics. But that's going to raise very significant challenges, particularly in relation to how we fund healthcare, because the more bespoke our approaches to medicine, the more costly those will be, partly because you lose the ability to save because of scale. So we're already familiar when we buy clothes or we have to furnish our homes. If you want something very specific,
limited edition,
you have to pay a lot more. You pay twice the price, or 3 times, or 10 times the price. If we want medicines that are specific for our child, and they might be much better for our child, we're going to have to pay 10 times the price.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
Or maybe 1,000 times the price. So that's going to pose really very significant challenges for our societies. How do we fund that? And of course, that also raises wider questions about equality, because when the costs of medicines rise, particularly when our society is having to say, well, look, we can do this, but not that. We can do X, but not Y. Y, if it's beneficial, then becomes available only to those who can afford it, the haves and the have-nots. And if those technologies, if those medicines are effective, then you potentially widen the divide within our societies between the healthy and the unhealthy, between the rich and the poor. So that we've seen those sorts of worries in science fiction, in Gattaca and lots of popular science fiction. We shouldn't get so afraid of those possibilities that we reject all of these technological advances, that we reject the potential benefits, for example, of gene therapies. But we need to anticipate that these are going to cause really serious problems, and we need to think about the better and worse ways that we could respond to those. Are there ways that we can address these really serious concerns about equality? How do we invest in our healthcare systems so that they're adequately funded to provide a good level of healthcare for all of our citizens, that we don't allow some to suffer because they're poor? How do we develop these technologies in ways and support the development of these technologies in ways that are hopefully going to be affordable? So those are very important questions that we're already grappling with, but that we're increasingly going to find very challenging.
Dominic, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.